we're just going to briefly come back together. I would like for you guys to share some of the things that you found in your exploration of the high essays that make them successful, and we will add to our list if you need to. So as you look in your own notebook, if someone mentions something you didn't think about as a team or as a partner, then you can add it to your list, okay? So who can please share the first bullet? What about introductions make them successful? Now our top essay was the middle one, just in case you didn't figure it out. So what was in that middle essay's introduction that you noticed that made it successful? Kirsten, thank you.
They went more into detail and then discussed the effect on the reader.
Okay. So instead of just identifying, right, tone, we don't just identify, we labeled the tone specifically, right? They had 3 different actual labels for that tone. If you look at it, it said negativity, pessimism, even morbidity. That's a fancy word right there, right? Okay. And then you tell us why that's important, because they talked about how it's developing a dynamic relationship between the swamp or the setting and the speaker, correct? So it's not just what is there, but specifically what is there, tone, and why. What's important about it. Anybody else have another way to word a successful introductions criteria? Shape.
I thought the middle one directly referenced the prompt. When it asks to analyze techniques the poet uses, they list out a couple techniques.
So it's more of a direct response.
Mhm.
Even the first one does that. It's just not as detailed. It's just literally a list, right? To create a large metaphor, right? Or it uses personification, alliteration, imagery, and diction to create a large metaphor. That's 5 techniques right there listed. But they don't really give us information about them that's detailed. It's just a list. So that's not as great. But it still is specific. It's not just saying using literary techniques. That would be too vague, right? So specificity, make sure you write that down. And then don't just identify, but try to explain why it's there. So if you can have a bigger picture statement in your intro, you're setting your essay up for more of an analytical focus and less of just the identification of these elements. We're not scavenger hunting through a poem, right? Okay, what about the second one? What's the organizational things that you note in the top essays? What did you note about the organization of it? Jordan.
It's a little more fluid than we're used to with prose. So instead of categorizing it by technique, it's in chronological order, follows the poem, and it'll quote direct evidence a word or two, and then explain it in the same sentence. And then it goes on to have more evidence and explanation still in the same sentence, so it feels more like narration as opposed to analysis.
So would you say we'll look into that for the third point, never mind. But when you talk about poetry, what does the organization of the order in the poem that you find these things, right? Like the beginning, middle, end of poem, what does that do to help us highlight in poetry? What element are we looking for? Yes? Shifts? Yes. It's about movement and shifts in poetry. And when you're getting an AP level complex poem, correct, there's gonna be a shift. There's gonna be some sort of complexity to that poem. So that's why going through it chronologically as you read instead of by technical element and organization that way is superior in poetry essays. It's better. So if you're gonna write down something for a second bullet, I want you to just talk about organize it by beginning, middle, end, as you probably learned last year if you're taking AP language, correct? So then Jordan kind of alluded to this, but for the third bullet, how often are details cited as evidence in the top essay? And really the top 2 essays had this. Did you see more or less citation of direct text than in your own essay? Generally. Okay, unless you got like a 6, but what did you see? Frequency. Or style. You can talk about that.
Yeah, I said it about the same time.
But you probably did pretty good.
I just listened to something point, but that has nothing to do.
Anybody have a comment about the organ, or I mean the usage of support? What did you see? Yeah, you can go into it a little bit more.
So the details, we see a lot less of entire stanzas being quoted. It's just a word or 2, and there's a lot. Every sentence has at least 1 quote, if not 2 or 3, except for transitions and intro sentences and things like that.
Right. So if you look in the first one, this is, I think, a really strong example of frequency. Almost every other word, it seems, has some sort of quotation around it. Now notice they don't have to cite line numbers, that's not required in a timed writing, because that takes time and you know that you're under the pressure of 40 minutes, correct? But it's like integrated small snippets of the poem. And I don't like to see, for poetry analysis especially, like a whole stanza, like Jordan mentioned, being cited, and then one sentence after it to explain that whole stanza. What you need to do is pick out the actual details, and I'll write questions in the margins of your essays when I see you not doing that, right? I'll write questions in your essay that says like, what specifically in that quote guides you to this tone? So it's usually a word or a phrase or an image or something like that, right? So that's what this first essay does really well. They just integrate that passage directly, or the reading directly into their writing. So it's not stand apart at all, okay? And the second one does it too. They're just like slightly more discussion. And then they talk about structure, of course, so then it's hard to quote structure. It's hard, okay? All right, and then the last thing, is there anything we missed that you would add to this that would make an essay successful when we're talking about poetry? Anything that you noticed as you were looking through the exemplars? What else did you notice?
I noticed that they both talked about complex feelings and like how they change throughout the poem, as opposed to just saying, oh, the poet has admiration towards the swamp, and then move on and write your entire essay about that.
And we noticed, if you guys start looking at your own poems and your own analysis, I noticed if you did just simplify it as a single emotion, and I probably asked you what other emotion might be represented and guide you maybe to a part of the poem that you didn't discuss. So for a couple students, I noticed that your essay kind of talked about the beginning and like the cosmos and the idea of being like in awe or admiration, and a lot of words like that came up. But then you might have missed the very ending, and sometimes you talk about how intimidating or overwhelming the swamp was, and that's also acceptable. But then at the end, you kind of missed that idea of that poor dry stick given one more chance to, bloom or branch or whatever. So just make sure that as you're looking for what Natalie said, as you're looking for what you're going to analyze, for that complexity of different emotion. And sometimes one word will fit, like the word melancholy is complex, or the word satirical is complex in itself, right? But you have to think about what are the different elements, what kinds of feelings, okay? And one more thing I would mention is just to balance in your technical elements, right? So last thing you'd want to write maybe is to balance those technical elements in so that they're not ignored and you're just talking about content, but you're talking about how that content is developed through those techniques. So they're integrated in both the top essays from the exemplars. They're just kind of in there as a place marker, but they're not necessarily the only focus, right? Okay, so that's it. So have those notes and then turn to your section 3